A photograph arrived at 412 Oak Street on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Michael Harrison, showing him standing in front of his own mailbox, wearing clothes he hadn't put on yet, holding an envelope he'd never seen before. The timestamp burned into the corner read 3:47 p.m., but it was only 9:15 a.m. when he opened it. His hands were shaking because the weather in the photo matched the forecast exactly, down to the clouds. The angle was impossible, taken from across the street where no one had been standing. Subscribe now, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about time. Franklin, Tennessee sits just south of Nashville, a town where Civil War history bleeds into modern subdivisions, where old money meets new development, where everyone knows their neighbors, but nobody talks about what happened on Lewisburg Pike in 1952. The streets are lined with magnolias and brick facades, coffee shops that serve the same families for generations, antique stores selling furniture that outlived their original owners. Michael had lived there his entire 42 years, working at the same accounting firm his father had worked at, driving the same route home every single day. That Tuesday morning started like every other morning. Coffee at 7 a.m., newspaper on the porch, silence in a house too big for one person. Nothing about the day suggested it would fracture everything he understood about reality. The envelope had no return address, just his name written in handwriting that looked eerily familiar, almost like his own, but not quite, the letters slanting differently. Inside was a single photograph, professional quality, printed on glossy paper that felt expensive between his fingers. He was standing there in the image, clear as anything, wearing the blue shirt that was currently hanging in his closet untouched. The mailbox number was visible, the house number clear, the oak tree in his yard showing the exact same branch pattern. But what stopped his breathing was the envelope in his photoself's hand, the same size and shape as the one he was currently holding. His mind tried to rationalize it, tried to find the logical explanation, but the timestamp kept screaming at him from the corner. Michael set the photo on his kitchen table and stared at it for 20 minutes, his coffee going cold in his hand. He checked his closet 3 times, confirming the blue shirt was still there, unworn, exactly where he'd left it after the dry cleaner. The rational part of his brain suggested Photoshop, suggested someone was playing an elaborate prank, but the detail was too perfect, too precise. The shadows fell correctly. The light matched the overcast sky he could see through his window. Even the small crack in his mailbox door that he'd been meaning to fix was visible in the photograph. He picked up his phone to call someone, anyone. But who do you call when you're holding evidence of something that hasn't happened yet? The clock on his wall ticked forward toward the impossible moment. At 10 a.m., Michael called his office and told them he wasn't feeling well, which wasn't exactly a lie because his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He spent the next hour pacing through his house, checking windows, looking for cameras, searching for any sign that someone had been watching him. The street outside was quiet like it always was on Tuesday mornings. The Hendersons already at work, the Clark's dog sleeping on their porch, Mrs. Patterson pruning her roses 3 houses down. Everything was normal, except for the photograph burning a hole in his perception of reality on the kitchen table. He tried to convince himself not to wear the blue shirt, not to check the mail at 3:47, to somehow avoid the predetermined moment. But curiosity is a powerful force, stronger than fear, stronger than logic. By noon, Michael had made a decision that would change everything. He would wait, he would watch, he would see if the photograph was somehow a prediction or just an incredibly detailed fake. He set up his phone to record video, pointing it out the front window toward the mailbox and street. He pulled out every photo album he owned, searching for any image that might have been doctored to create this impossible picture, but found nothing that matched. The blue shirt hung in his closet like a dare, like a challenge from the universe itself. He made a sandwich he didn't eat, stared at walls, counted the minutes. The photograph sat on the table, unchanging, impossible, real. Franklin had always been a town where strange things happened quietly, where people whispered about the family on Carter Street who disappeared in 1978, leaving dinner on the table, where old-timers still talked about the lights seen over the battlefield in 1963. Michael's grandfather used to tell stories about time being different here, about how the Civil War soldiers sometimes seemed to walk again at dusk, about how certain houses held echoes of conversations that hadn't happened yet. Michael had always dismissed these as small-town folklore, the kind of stories every southern town collects like dust. But now, holding evidence that shouldn't exist, he wondered if his grandfather had known something, had experienced something, had tried to warn him in the only way that wouldn't sound completely insane. The town's history suddenly felt heavier, more significant, like every strange story had been trying to tell him something. At 2 p.m., Michael found himself pulling the blue shirt from the closet, his hands moving almost automatically, as if the photograph had already determined his choices. He put it on, the fabric feeling wrong against his skin, like wearing someone else's destiny. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw the exact image from the photograph, the collar sitting the same way, the buttons aligned identically. It was like stepping into a mold that had been cast from his future, becoming the person in the picture whether he wanted to or not. The inevitability of it felt suffocating, like free will was just an illusion he'd been comfortable believing. He went back downstairs and stared at the clock, watching the minutes crawl toward 3:47. The video camera on his phone was still recording, capturing hours of an empty street, an unchanged mailbox, a reality that was about to prove itself stranger than he'd ever imagined. Michael sat in his living room, the photograph in front of him, comparing every detail to his current appearance. The watch on his wrist in the photo was the same one he was wearing now, showing the correct time. The small coffee stain on his shirt sleeve that he'd just noticed was visible in the photograph too, even though he'd just put the shirt on. It was as if the photograph had known he would spill coffee at 2:30, which he had, reaching for his cup with shaking hands. The layers of predetermined moments were stacking up, crushing his sense of control. But that was only the beginning. At 3 p.m., Michael walked to his front window and looked out at the street, searching for any sign of who might have taken the photograph, or who would take it in 47 minutes. The angle suggested someone standing near the Jeffersons' driveway across the street, but that spot was empty, had been empty all day according to his video. He considered calling the police, but what would he tell them? That he'd received a photograph from the future, that he was living out a moment that had been captured before it existed. They'd think he was having a breakdown. Maybe they'd be right. The sun was hidden behind the exact clouds shown in the photograph, the light casting the same gray pallor over his lawn. He checked his watch, 3:15, then 3:20, then 3:25, time moving forward with the inevitability of a train on tracks. Franklin's main street was probably busy with the after-school rush, parents picking up kids, the coffee shop filling with the late afternoon crowd, life continuing normally for everyone except Michael Harrison. He thought about his father, who had died 3 years ago, who had spent his last year talking about moments feeling familiar, about living the same day twice, about photographs in his mind that didn't match his memories. Michael had attributed it to the medication, to the decline, to the cruel tricks the brain plays when it starts to fail. Now he wondered if his father had experienced something similar, if there was a pattern in their family, if time operated differently for them. The thought should have been comforting, connecting him to his father, but instead it felt like inheriting a curse. The clock showed 3:35. He picked up the envelope that had arrived that morning, the one visible in the photograph he would be holding in 12 minutes, and examined it again for any clue he might have missed. The paper was standard white, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, the handwriting on it somehow both familiar and foreign. He looked at the photo again and noticed something he hadn't seen before, a detail so small he'd missed it in his initial panic. In the photograph, there was a second envelope visible in his mailbox behind him, just the corner of it showing, white with what might have been red writing. Michael's heart rate increased because there had been no second envelope in his mail that morning, just this one impossible photograph. He checked his watch, 3:40. The 7 minutes between 3:40 and 3:47 felt like they lasted hours and seconds simultaneously, time becoming elastic and strange. Michael stood up, sat down, stood up again, paced to the window, returned to the chair, his body unable to decide what to do with the anticipation. He could refuse to go outside, could lock the doors, could try to break the predetermined moment, but the photograph suggested that he would go, that he would stand there, that the moment was already written. The philosophical implications were staggering, but he didn't have time to process them. At 3:44, he picked up the envelope containing the photograph and walked to his front door. At 3:45, he opened it. At 3:46, he stepped onto his porch. At 3:47, he walked to his mailbox, and the world shifted. Standing at the mailbox, Michael turned and looked at the spot across the street where the photograph must have been taken, and saw nothing but empty pavement and Mrs. Patterson's cat crossing the road. He looked down at the envelope in his hand, matching the image perfectly. his blue shirt catching the gray light exactly as shown. The moment was happening. He was inside the photograph, living the predetermined instant. He opened the mailbox with his free hand and felt his breath catch because there, exactly as suggested by the hidden detail, was a second envelope, white, with red handwriting, addressed to him. No return address. His hand shook as he pulled it out, the first envelope nearly falling from his grip. Somewhere, somehow, a photograph was being taken, capturing this exact moment, preparing to be sent backward to his past self. But that was only the beginning. Michael stood frozen at his mailbox for several seconds that felt like minutes, holding both envelopes, becoming aware that he was now past the moment shown in the photograph, that time had continued beyond what had been predicted. The second envelope felt heavier than the first, substantial in a way that suggested multiple pages inside. He looked around the street again, searching for any sign of observation, any hint of who was orchestrating this impossible sequence. Mrs. Patterson had gone back inside. Her cat had disappeared. The Jeffersons' house remained empty. The street was returning to its usual Tuesday afternoon silence. Michael walked back into his house with both envelopes, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The rational world he'd lived in that morning was gone, replaced by something that operated under different rules. Inside, Michael set both envelopes on the kitchen table next to the original photograph and stared at them like they were artifacts from another dimension. His phone was still recording, capturing the moment he'd returned inside, time-stamping everything with mundane precision. He rewound the video and watched himself walk to the mailbox, seeing the exact moment match the photograph, confirming that everything had happened as predicted. But the video showed no photographer, no camera across the street, no source for the image. The angle had been perfect, the timing exact, yet the street had been completely empty. He felt like he was being watched by something that could observe without being present, something that could document moments before they existed. The second envelope sat unopened, promising answers or more questions. The red handwriting on the second envelope was definitely his own. He recognized it now, the way he formed the letter H in Harrison, the specific slant of his cursive. But he hadn't written this address, hadn't sent this envelope to himself, had never seen it before opening his mailbox 14 minutes ago. The postmark was from Franklin, dated today, mailed this morning from the downtown post office. He picked it up and held it to the light, seeing the shadow of what appeared to be several folded papers inside and possibly another photograph. The weight of it suggested something significant, something prepared with care. Michael's hands were steadier now, the initial shock giving way to a strange curiosity, a need to understand what was happening to him. He carefully opened the second envelope and pulled out its contents, and his understanding of everything shattered completely. Inside were 3 photographs and a handwritten letter, all in his handwriting, all dated tomorrow. The first photograph showed him sitting at this exact kitchen table, older somehow, his hair grayer at the temples, reading the same letter he was about to read. The second photograph showed his father, alive, standing in Michael's backyard, but the trees were wrong, fuller, greener, like it was taken in a different season or different year. The third photograph showed a woman Michael didn't recognize, standing in his living room, smiling at the camera, wearing a wedding ring. The letter was 3 pages long, written in his handwriting but with language he wouldn't use, knowledge he didn't possess. It began with the words, "I know you're confused. I was too. But you need to understand what's about to happen to you, what's been happening to our family for generations." The timestamp on the first photo read tomorrow's date, 4:15 p.m. Michael read the letter 3 times, each reading making him feel more disconnected from reality, more certain that he'd fallen into something beyond normal human experience. The letter explained that he was about to start experiencing moments out of sequence, receiving information from his future self, living days that hadn't happened yet through photographs and messages. It described a condition, if you could call it that had affected his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather before him, a genetic anomaly that made them unstable in time. The letter warned him about decisions he would make, told him about the woman in the photograph who he would meet in 3 weeks, explained that his father's final year hadn't been decline but rather an acceleration of the time slips. It provided instructions, guidance, warnings about what to do and what to avoid. It ended with the words, The photographs will keep coming, you'll keep sending them backward, and eventually you'll understand that time isn't a line, it's a circle, and we're caught in the loop. Franklin suddenly felt different to Michael, like he was seeing it for the first time, or maybe seeing it as it really was beneath the surface of normal life. He thought about all the strange stories, the disappeared families, the lights over the battlefield, the buildings where people reported seeing events before they happened. What if it wasn't folklore? What if Franklin sat on some kind of temporal weak point, someplace where time was thinner, more permeable? The letter mentioned the town specifically, suggested that living here his entire life had made the condition worse, that the Civil War battlefield held some significance he didn't yet understand. His grandfather's stories about soldiers walking through time suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like observation. Michael walked to his window and looked out at the ordinary street with new eyes, wondering how many of his neighbors were living in moments that belonged to different times. The photograph of his father stood out among the others. Impossible because his father had been cremated 3 years ago, his ashes scattered in the Harpeth River per his wishes. Yet here he was in the image, looking solid and real, standing in what appeared to be tomorrow's version of Michael's backyard. The letter had mentioned him, had said cryptically, "You'll see him again. Not the way you expect, but you'll understand when it happens that time doesn't take people the same way we think it does." Michael studied his father's face in the photo, looking for signs of manipulation, of digital trickery, but everything looked authentic. The shadows fell correctly. The background matched his actual yard. Even the old fence post that he'd been planning to replace was visible. His father's expression was peaceful, knowing, like he was aware of being photographed, aware of the message it would send. The timestamp read tomorrow, 10:22 a.m. Night fell on Franklin, and Michael sat in his kitchen surrounded by impossible evidence, his mind trying to construct a framework that could contain these events. He made coffee he didn't drink, ordered food he didn't eat, existed in a space between disbelief and acceptance. The letter had instructed him to wait, to not tell anyone, to prepare for what would happen tomorrow when he would supposedly encounter the moments shown in the photographs. It had also told him that he would take these photographs himself, that future Michael would know the exact moments to capture, would know to send them backward to this Tuesday morning. The paradox of it should have made the whole thing collapse, but instead it felt inevitable, like a story that had already been written, and he was just now reading it. The town outside his window settled into darkness, and Michael Harrison sat in the middle of a mystery that was still unfolding. At midnight, Michael finally went upstairs to attempt sleep, bringing the photographs and letter with him, unable to let them out of his sight. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about predetermined moments, about free will, about whether any choice he'd made today had actually been his own. The blue shirt had seemed like his decision. Walking to the mailbox had felt like his choice. Opening the second envelope had appeared to be his action. But if all of it had been photographed yesterday or tomorrow or whenever these images actually originated, then what did choice even mean? His father used to talk about feeling like an actor in a play someone else had written, and Michael had attributed it to depression, to existential crisis, to the normal questioning that comes with age. Now he wondered if his father had been describing exactly this feeling, this sense of living out moments that had already been observed. The darkness outside his window felt heavier than usual, pregnant with the weight of tomorrow. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when tomorrow becomes today, and the photographs start to make terrible sense. Wednesday morning arrived with the same gray sky shown in yesterday's photographs, the same diffused light, the same atmospheric pressure that made the air feel thick. Michael woke at 6 a.m. having slept maybe 2 hours, his mind too active, too full of temporal paradoxes and impossible questions. He went downstairs and made coffee, the routine feeling strange now, like every action might be predetermined, might already exist in a photograph he hadn't received yet. The 3 pictures from the second envelope sat on his table, showing moments that were supposed to happen today, showing impossibilities that the universe insisted were inevitable. He picked up the photo of himself looking older and studied it closely, noting the small details that suggested aging, the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples. If this was really tomorrow at 4:15 p.m., then something would happen today that would age him, or the photograph was from much further in the future and the date was wrong. At 9 a.m., Michael did something the letter had specifically warned him not to do. He went to his father's grave at the Rest Haven Cemetery on the east side of Franklin. The morning was cold, the grass wet with dew, the old oak trees creating shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. His father's headstone was simple, just name and dates. No epitaph because Michael hadn't been able to think of words that felt true. He stood there for 20 minutes, looking at the engraved dates, thinking about the photograph showing his father alive in his backyard tomorrow morning at 10:22. The letter had said he was disobeying by coming here, that some things needed to happen without interference, but Michael needed to see the grave, needed to confirm the impossibility. The stone was real, solid, immovable, proof that his father was gone. Yet the photograph suggested otherwise, and Michael was beginning to understand that proof meant nothing when time started to break down. Back home by 10 a.m., Michael positioned himself in his backyard at the exact spot where tomorrow's photograph showed his father standing. He stood there at 10:22, matching the timestamp, feeling foolish and desperate and hopeful all at once. The yard was empty except for him. The fence post stood where it always had. The trees swayed in the morning breeze. Nothing supernatural occurred. No temporal rift opened, no ghost appeared. No father materialized from yesterday or tomorrow or 3 years ago. Michael stood there until 10:45, waiting for something, anything, to validate the photograph. Finally, he went back inside, feeling the weight of disappointment mixed with relief, because maybe this meant the photographs were wrong. Maybe reality was going to stay intact after all. But then he saw it, sitting on his kitchen table where it definitely hadn't been before, a fourth envelope. This envelope was different, older looking, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but still recognizable as his own. No postmark, no stamp, just his name written in the same hand that had addressed all the others. Michael's heart was racing as he opened it because he hadn't heard anyone enter his house, hadn't left the backyard for more than a few minutes, yet this envelope had appeared like it had been there all along. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, showing two men standing in what appeared to be his backyard but decades ago. The fence post new, the trees much smaller. One of the men was clearly his grandfather, young, maybe 30 years old, wearing clothes from the 1950s. The other man looked exactly like Michael, same face, same build, same expression, but standing in a photograph that had to be 70 years old. On the back, written in his grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "To my grandson, proof that we are unstuck, taken 1953, received 1954, sent 2025. The implications crashed over Michael like a wave, drowning his ability to rationalize, pulling him under into something that resembled acceptance mixed with terror. His grandfather had experienced this, had met his adult grandson somehow in 1953, had photographed the impossible moment, and then kept the photograph for decades, waiting to send it forward to this exact morning. The letter from yesterday had mentioned generations, had suggested this ran in the family, but Michael hadn't fully grasped the scope until now. He was looking at proof that he would somehow exist in 1953, would meet his young grandfather, would stand in his own backyard 72 years before this moment. The paradoxes were stacking up, creating a structure of impossibility that was somehow more real than the normal world he'd lived in just 24 hours ago. Time wasn't broken. It had always been this way, and his family had been navigating it for generations. Michael spent the next hour searching his house for more evidence, more photographs, more messages that might have been left for him across time. He found a box in his attic he'd never noticed before, tucked behind old Christmas decorations, labeled with his name in his father's handwriting. Inside were dozens of photographs, all showing moments that appeared impossible. His father with Michael as an adult in pictures taken when Michael was a child, his grandfather with both of them in images that predated Michael's birth. There were letters, journals, detailed accounts of the family's experiences with what they called the drift, descriptions of moments lived out of sequence, warnings about decisions that echoed across decades. His great-grandfather had written about seeing the future in dreams that turned out to be memories, about meeting his descendants before they were born, about the terrible responsibility of knowing too much. The box was a family archive of temporal displacement, proof that Michael wasn't going crazy. He was just the latest in a long line of men unstuck in time. At 2 p.m., Michael sat in his living room and waited for 4:15, the time shown in the photograph of himself looking older, reading the letter he'd already read. The letter had told him what would happen, had explained that at 4:15 he would understand everything, would experience something that would age him instantly, would send the photographs backward himself. He tried to prepare mentally, tried to imagine what could cause someone to age years in moments, what revelation could be so profound it would show on your face. The woman in the third photograph was still a mystery, the one supposedly standing in his living room tomorrow, the one with the wedding ring who he was meant to meet in 3 weeks. Michael looked around his empty living room, trying to imagine her there, trying to picture a future that had already been photographed. The clock on his wall ticked toward the moment of truth, each second feeling like a decision he wasn't making. But the truth comes differently than you expect when you're waiting for it, crashing in from angles you weren't watching. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 24 hours after the first photograph's timestamp, Michael's doorbell rang. He opened it to find a woman standing on his porch. The same woman from the third photograph wearing the same clothes, the same wedding ring catching the gray afternoon light. She looked at him with eyes that held recognition and sadness, and something that might have been love, and she said, "I know this is confusing, I'm Sarah. We've been married for 5 years in my timeline, but you haven't met me yet in yours." Michael's mind tried to process this, tried to find the logical explanation, but she continued, "I need you to take a photograph of me in your living room at exactly 4:15 and send it backward to yesterday morning, because that's how this works. That's how we met, through photographs that don't make sense until they do." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, familiar with his house in a way that suggested she'd lived there, that in some version of time she belonged there. Sarah moved through his house like she owned it, adjusting the picture frame that was always crooked, avoiding the floorboard that creaked in the hallway, heading straight for the kitchen, where the photographs were still spread across the table. She looked at them and smiled sadly, saying, "You kept these, you always keep these. Every version of you saves the photographs because they're proof that we're real, that the drift isn't madness." Michael followed her, his voice finally working enough to ask, "What's happening to me?" She turned and looked at him with such tenderness that it hurt, responding, "You're becoming unstuck, like your father, like his father before him. You're starting to exist in multiple moments simultaneously. And I'm here because I exist in your future the same way your father exists in tomorrow morning." She explained that she had been receiving photographs too, images of Michael appearing in her life 3 weeks from now, that they'd met across time before they met in chronological sequence. Michael's watch showed 4 p.m., and Sarah asked him to set up his phone to take a photograph at exactly 4:15, to capture her standing in the living room, to create the image that would be sent backward to yesterday morning. He did as she instructed, his hands moving automatically, his mind still trying to catch up to a reality that included a wife he hadn't met yet. Sarah stood in the exact spot shown in the photograph from yesterday, her smile sad and knowing, and she told him, "After you take this, I have to leave. I have to return to my timeline, but we'll meet again in 3 weeks at the coffee shop on Main Street, and you'll think it's the first time, but it won't be. It will be the 100th time across all the different moments." She explained that their relationship existed outside of linear time, that they'd been married and would be married, and were married in a way that chronological thinking couldn't contain. The phone timer showed 4:10. At 4:12, Sarah told him something that changed everything, explained the real truth that the letter had been leading toward. "Your father isn't dead," she said quietly. "He's just existing in a different moment now, permanently unstuck from the timeline you're in, living in the spaces between when things happen." She explained that the drift eventually takes everyone in his family, that they don't die so much as they disperse across time, existing in all their moments simultaneously, until the linear experience of life becomes impossible to maintain. Tomorrow morning at 10:22, you'll see him in the backyard because he'll be there, not as a ghost but as a person who exists in that moment just as validly as you exist in this one. The photograph from the second envelope suddenly made perfect sense. His father wasn't dead. He was just living in tomorrow morning and yesterday, and probably in moments Michael would never directly observe. The relief and terror of this were overwhelming. The timer on Michael's phone hit 4:15 and automatically took the photograph, capturing Sarah in his living room, creating the image that would be sent backward through time to yesterday morning, completing the loop that had started this whole sequence. She looked at the result, nodded with satisfaction, and said, "This is the hard part, Michael. Knowing that we're both real, but existing in moments that don't line up yet, but in 3 weeks when we meet at the coffee shop, you have to remember to act like it's the first time. Because for the version of you that exists then it will be." She kissed him on the cheek, a gesture that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, and then walked to his front door. Before leaving, she turned and said, "The photographs you'll send yourself, you need to send them exactly when and how you received them, because if you don't, none of this happens, none of it stabilizes into a pattern we can navigate." Then she was gone, and Michael was alone with the understanding that he would never be alone again. Not really, because he existed in multiple moments. At 5 p.m., Michael went to his backyard and stood at the fence post, thinking about tomorrow morning at 10:22, about his father existing there even though he also existed here. 3 years after his death, that wasn't really a death. He thought about Sarah, about meeting her in 3 weeks while knowing he'd been married to her in some other configuration of time. The sun was setting on Franklin, casting long shadows across yards that had held multiple versions of the same people across different decades. Michael Harrison understood now that the small town wasn't just a place where strange things happened. It was a place where time itself was unstable, where the past and future leaked into the present, where families like his existed in the cracks between moments. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him, aging him in ways that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with understanding too much too quickly. That night, Michael followed the instructions from the letter he'd received yesterday from his future self. He printed the 3 photographs from the second envelope, wrote the letter explaining everything to his past self, added the photograph of Sarah at 4:15, sealed it all in a white envelope with red handwriting, and drove to the post office downtown. The clerk who took the envelope looked at him strangely when he insisted it be postmarked for today and delivered this morning. But in Franklin, strange requests were common enough that she just nodded and processed it without comment. Michael watched his envelope disappear into the system that would somehow deliver it backward to yesterday morning, creating the loop that had brought him to this understanding. On the drive home, he stopped at a photo shop that still developed film and spent an hour creating the first photograph, the one showing himself at the mailbox at 3:47 p.m., using techniques he'd learned from his father years ago that he'd never understood the purpose of until now. At midnight on Wednesday, Michael finished sending the first photograph backward to Tuesday morning, using a process described in his great-grandfather's journal that involved specific postal codes and timing that defied conventional understanding. The photograph would arrive Tuesday morning before he woke, starting the sequence that would lead him to this moment of sending it, creating a loop that had no clear beginning or end. He sat in his kitchen, surrounded by evidence of his family's temporal displacement, understanding that his father's final year hadn't been confusion. It had been the drift accelerating, pulling him into all his moments at once until the linear experience became impossible. Michael would walk that same path eventually, would become like his grandfather who existed in 1953, and now simultaneously, would scatter across time until the concept of a single present moment became meaningless. The thought should have been terrifying, and it was, but it was also strangely comforting, knowing that death wasn't an end, just a dispersal into different when. Thursday morning arrived, and Michael woke early to position himself in the backyard by 10 a.m., preparing to see his father at 10:22 like the photograph had promised. He stood at the fence post as the minutes ticked by, his heart pounding with hope and fear and the strange certainty that comes from living out a moment you've already seen documented. At 10:22 exactly, the air seemed to thicken slightly, the light shifting in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. And there he was, Michael's father standing 3 feet away, looking solid and real and alive. They stared at each other for a long moment before his father smiled and said, "I'm sorry I couldn't explain it better when I was dying. I was already drifting then, already existing in too many moments to make sense linearly." They talked for 17 minutes, his father explaining the drift, the family's history, the reason Franklin was the center of it all, before the moment ended, and he faded back into whatever when he primarily existed in now. The conversation with his father revealed things the letter hadn't covered, secrets about the family's connection to Franklin that went back to the Civil War, to a moment on the battlefield when time had briefly stopped for reasons no one understood. His father explained that their family had been present at that moment, had been changed by it, had become unstuck in ways that compounded through generations. "We're not cursed," his father had said. "We're just observers in a place where time doesn't flow the way it should, and Franklin is the center of it, the eye of a temporal storm that's been spinning since 1864. He told Michael about other families in town who experienced similar phenomena, about a network of people living out of sequence, about the unspoken understanding that bound them together. Before fading, his father's last words were, "Take care of Sarah when you meet her chronologically. She's the only one who really understands what you're going through. She's unstuck too." Then he was gone, and Michael was alone in the backyard. But not really alone. Never really alone again. Over the next 3 weeks, Michael received more photographs, more messages from different versions of himself, creating a map of his life that extended in both directions from any given present moment. He saw himself at 60, at 70, at ages he hadn't reached yet but apparently would. He saw his grandfather again in more photographs from the 1950s, his great-grandfather in images from the 1920s, all of them meeting their descendants across time, all of them navigating the drift with varying degrees of success. The house became a repository of temporal evidence, boxes of photographs showing moments that hadn't happened yet, and events that were long past occurring simultaneously. Franklin outside his windows looked different now, like he could see the layers of time stacked on top of each other, the Civil War soldiers flickering at the edges of his vision, the future residents of his house moving through rooms that would exist decades from now. On the day he was scheduled to meet Sarah chronologically, Michael woke with the strange double awareness that he'd been married to her for 5 years and had never met her at all. The photographs had shown him their wedding, their first house, arguments they would have, moments of joy that existed in some future version of his life. But today at 2 p.m., he would walk into the coffee shop on Main Street and see her for what his linear mind considered the first time, and he would have to pretend that the recognition flooding through him was just attraction, just interest, just the normal beginning of a relationship. The letter from himself had been explicit. He had to let it unfold naturally, had to not mention the photographs or the drift or the version of her that had visited him 3 weeks ago. The complexity of maintaining this fiction while knowing the truth was exhausting, but apparently it was necessary for the timeline to stabilize. At 2 p.m., Michael sat in the coffee shop and watched Sarah walk in, and the moment was both exactly like the photographs and completely different because she was moving, breathing, real in a way the images couldn't capture. She ordered a coffee, looked around the room, and her eyes met his with a flash of recognition that she quickly covered with a smile that looked practiced. She walked over, asked if the seat was taken, and Michael said no, playing his role in a scene they'd apparently performed across multiple timelines. They talked for 3 hours, the conversation flowing with the ease of people who already knew each other pretending they didn't, and when she finally stood to leave, she touched his hand and said, "I'll see you again," with an emphasis that suggested she meant it in more ways than the obvious. Michael watched her walk out and wondered how many times they'd had this first meeting, how many versions of this moment existed in the spaces between when things happened. The next 6 months of Michael's life were a strange blend of chronological progression and temporal awareness, living forward while receiving constant reminders that time was more fluid than he'd ever imagined. He dated Sarah in the normal way while knowing they were already married in some configuration of moments, went to work, and maintained his routine, while photographs of his future self continued to arrive, showing different versions of how his life would unfold. His father appeared periodically in the backyard, existing in different ages, sometimes younger than Michael, sometimes older, always offering guidance about navigating the drift. The town of Franklin continued its quiet existence, and Michael began to notice the others, the people at the grocery store who moved slightly out of sync, the neighbors who seemed to age and unage between sightings, the whole community of unstuck people living parallel to the normal residents who never noticed the temporal irregularities. But the real truth, the one the letter hadn't fully explained, came 6 months to the day after the first photograph arrived. Michael woke up on a Tuesday morning to find himself standing in his backyard in 1953, looking at his young grandfather, who was holding a camera and grinning. "You're here," his grandfather said, as if Michael being 72 years in his own past was the most natural thing in the world. "I've been waiting for this moment since the photographs started arriving last year." They spent the day together, Michael helping his grandfather understand the drift, explaining what would happen to his family, warning him about decisions that would echo across decades. At sunset, his grandfather took the photograph that Michael had found in the yellowed envelope 6 months ago, creating another loop in the infinite series of predetermined moments. Then the day ended, and Michael was back in his own time, standing in the same backyard but 72 years later, understanding that he now existed in both moments permanently. The drift was accelerating. Michael could feel it. the same way his father must have felt it in his final year. Moments were starting to overlap, Michael existing in multiple times simultaneously, conversations with Sarah happening across different years of their relationship at once. He would be having breakfast in 2025, while also experiencing dinner in 2027, would be meeting her father in the future, while also attending his own father's funeral in the past. All moments bleeding into each other until the concept of a single present became absurd. The letter he'd received from himself had warned about this phase, had called it the convergence, the point where the linear experience of life breaks down completely and you start existing in all your moments at once. His father had reached this point, his grandfather too, all the men in his family eventually dispersing across time until they were everywhere and nowhere, always and never. Franklin at night looked different from every possible when, the streetlights creating patterns across decades, the old houses showing their histories simultaneously, the battlefield holding all its moments at once. Michael stood on his porch and saw the town as it was in 1864, in 1953, in 2025, in 2047, all versions existing together in a palimpsest of time. The Civil War soldiers walked through the same streets where modern cars drove. Children from different centuries played in the same parks across the years. And Franklin revealed itself as the temporal anomaly it had always been. The families like his had been drawn here across generations, pulled by the same force that had stopped time on the battlefield in 1864, creating a community of people who existed out of sequence, who navigated the drift together, even though they rarely spoke about it openly. The weight of all these moments was crushing and liberating at once. On what Michael's linear mind insisted was 1 year after the first photograph arrived, though he was also experiencing it as 10 years and no time at all, he married Sarah in a ceremony that existed in multiple moments simultaneously. His father was there, young and old at once. His grandfather attended from 1953 and 2025. Relatives who were dead and not yet born stood together in a wedding that defied chronological understanding. Sarah looked at him with eyes that held all their years together, past and future, and said vows that acknowledged the strange nature of their love, promising to find him in every moment, every when, every version of the timeline where they existed. The photographs of this wedding had been arriving for months, showing him the moment from different angles, different years, different versions of themselves, and now he was inside it, creating the images that would be sent backward and forward to anchor it in the temporal structure of their lives. The house on Oak Street became the center of Michael's existence across time, the stable point from which he experienced all other moments. He would sit in the kitchen in 2025 while also standing in the backyard in 1953, would sleep in the bedroom in 1 year while waking in another, the house itself seeming to exist in all its versions at once. Sarah moved through it with practiced ease, navigating the temporal overlaps with the skill of someone who'd been doing it longer, helping Michael learn to exist in multiple whens without losing his sense of self entirely. She explained that the house had always been this way, that the families who lived here were all connected through the drift, that the walls held memories of moments that hadn't happened yet, and events long past simultaneously. The oak tree in the front yard had witnessed every version of them, growing and ungrowing, existing in all its ages at once. Michael's work suffered as the drift accelerated, his ability to maintain a normal schedule breaking down when he existed in too many moments simultaneously. He tried to explain to his boss that he was experiencing temporal displacement, but the words came out wrong, sounding like mental illness rather than an accurate description of his reality. Eventually, he stopped going to the office, stopped trying to maintain the fiction of a linear life, instead focusing on learning to navigate the drift from others who understood. There was Mrs. Patterson 3 houses down who had been unstuck for 40 years, the Jefferson family who all experienced time out of sequence, the whole network of Franklin residents who lived parallel to normal reality. They met in coffee shops that existed in multiple decades, shared photographs of moments that proved the drift was real, helped each other stay anchored enough to function while existing everywhere at once. The letters from his future self became more frequent and more fragmentary as that version of Michael dispersed further across time. The handwriting remained the same, but the content became less linear, more poetic, descriptions of existing in all moments at once, of losing the anchor of a single present, of becoming pure observation spread across the timeline. "It's not death," one letter said. "It's expansion. You don't stop existing. You just stop existing in one specific when, and the relief of it is extraordinary once you accept it. Another letter was just a list of moments worth experiencing fully, specific dates and times when something beautiful happened that Michael should pay attention to when he got there. The future version of himself was trying to help his past self navigate what he'd already experienced, creating loops of guidance that extended in both directions from any given moment. 2 years after the first photograph arrived, or 5 years, or no time at all depending on how Michael counted it, his father appeared in the kitchen and told him it was almost time to let go of linear existence completely. "You've been holding on," his father said gently, trying to maintain a single present moment. "But you're ready now to exist the way we really do, dispersed across time, experiencing everything simultaneously." Michael understood what he meant, could feel the pull toward dispersal, the exhaustion of trying to stay anchored to one when he existed in so many. His father explained that the final stage wasn't frightening, it was liberating, that once you stopped fighting the drift and accepted existing in all your moments at once, the peace of it was profound. "You'll still be you," his father promised, "just a you that experiences everything at once instead of sequentially, and you'll finally understand why we call it the drift instead of the curse." Sarah held him that night in a moment that existed across multiple years of their marriage, her presence the only constant in his increasingly fractured experience of time. She whispered that she'd let go of linear existence 3 months ago or 2 years ago, or hadn't yet depending on how you measured it, that she was already dispersed across all her moments but could still anchor herself in specific whens when she needed to be with him. "We'll find each other in every moment," she promised. "The drift doesn't separate us. It just means we exist together in all our times at once instead of just one." Michael felt the truth of this, could sense the version of Sarah that existed at 20 and 40 and 60 all present in the woman holding him now. The house around them was breathing with all its moments, and Michael finally stopped fighting it, stopped trying to maintain a single present and let himself disperse into the drift completely. The sensation of letting go was like falling upward into every moment he'd ever experienced and would ever experience. Michael Harrison existing at 5 years old and 80 years old and every age in between simultaneously. He was standing in his backyard in 1953 with his grandfather, while also sitting in the kitchen in 2025 with Sarah, while also attending his own birth in 1983, while also experiencing his dispersal in 2027, all moments happening at once without sequence or hierarchy. The terror of it lasted no time at all because time didn't exist the way it had before. And then there was just the profound peace of experiencing everything at once. He could see Franklin across all its years, the town existing as a temporal structure rather than a geographical location, and he understood finally why his family had been drawn here, why the drift centered on this place. The Civil War moment when time had stopped was still happening, was always happening, and his family existed in the echo of it, permanently unstuck, permanently everywhere. Somewhere in the infinite moments of his dispersed existence, Michael Harrison walked to his mailbox on a Tuesday morning in 2025 and found a photograph of himself taken tomorrow, and he understood it perfectly because he was the one who took it, who sent it backward, who created the loop that had no beginning. He was also his grandfather taking the photograph in 1953, was his father explaining the drift in 2028, was himself at 80 teaching his grandson how to navigate temporal displacement. All the moments existed at once, and he was present in everyone, experiencing his entire life simultaneously instead of sequentially. The photographs weren't from the future or the past anymore. They were just documentation of moments that all existed in the eternal present of the drift. And somewhere in all those moments, Sarah was there too, finding him across every when, their love existing outside of chronological time in a space where forever meant something different than most people understood. Franklin, Tennessee continues to exist in all its moments at once, a small town where time doesn't flow the way it should, where families experience the drift across generations, where the Civil War never really ended because it's always still happening in the spaces between when. The normal residents notice nothing unusual, live their sequential lives, age and die in the conventional way. But underneath, in the temporal structure of the place, there are people like Michael Harrison who exist everywhere at once, who walk through multiple decades simultaneously, who have learned to navigate a reality where time is just another dimension to move through rather than a river carrying you forward. The photographs still arrive, still get sent backward, still create loops that anchor the unstuck in some semblance of structure, And the drift continues, patient and inevitable, waiting for the next generation to begin receiving images of moments they haven't experienced yet. The story doesn't end because it never began, it just exists in all its moments at once. Michael Harrison receiving the first photograph and taking the first photograph and explaining the drift to his past self and learning it from his future self simultaneously. The oak tree in his yard has witnessed every version of him. The kitchen table has held every impossible photograph. The house on Oak Street has been the center of his dispersed existence across all his years at once. Sarah is there in every moment too. Their wedding happening eternally. Their first meeting at the coffee shop existing forever. Their love unbound by the sequential experience of time. This is what it means to be from Franklin. To be part of the families who drift. To live in a place where the past and future bleed into the present until all moments are equally now. This is what the photographs have always been trying to show. That time is not a line but a space, and some people learn to exist in all of it at once. The truth is that Michael Harrison never stopped existing after the drift took him completely. He just stopped existing in only one moment. And if you know how to look, if you understand the temporal structure of Franklin, Tennessee, you can still see him sometimes, walking to his mailbox across multiple decades, standing in his backyard talking to his father who is also his grandson, living with Sarah in a house that contains all their years together. The photographs keep circulating through time, arriving before they're sent, creating loops that stabilize the drift into something navigable. And somewhere in all those moments, in all those photographs, in all the versions of Michael Harrison that exist simultaneously, there is peace in the understanding that nothing ends. It just disperses into every moment it ever touched, existing forever in the eternal present of the drift. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved but experienced, and the mystery of time in Franklin, Tennessee is one that unfolds across lifetimes, across generations, across every moment at once, revealing truth that can only be understood by those who stop trying to exist in just one when, and learn to live in all of them simultaneously. The impossible has become ordinary for Michael Harrison. The supernatural has revealed itself as just a different kind of natural, and time has shown itself to be far stranger and more beautiful than anyone living sequentially could imagine. So subscribe to the channel because the next story waiting in the drift might be yours.